50 years ago today was the end of a major experiment in Northern Ireland, possibly one of the most audacious experiments that ever happened in Northern Ireland in its history. The collapse on that day of the Sunningdale executive. And as Seamus Mallon famously said, the rest of us spent about 30 years as slow learners waiting to catch it up, which says something about the people who are in this room and on some of the panels today, because it suggests that these are the people who were ahead of their times. And when you look at some of the structures that Sunningdale tried to innovate, British-Irish collaboration and supporting negotiation, power sharing at its core, trying to address the issue of North-South relations, you can see very much that the entire structure of what we are still working with can't be divorced from the decisions and the experiments that were made then. So it's interesting to be in a place where 50 years ago, I suppose, was one of the days where this would have been considered a failure, that the Sunningdale Agreement was a failure. And in political science terms, I suppose, it's looked at as an experiment which didn't work and it took a while to go on. But if you take it at a slightly more analytical level and say, were some of the ideas that were put forward at Sunningdale ahead of their time and therefore not a failure? They were part of a really, really painful, and still many years of pain to go after Sunningdale, a painful effort to try to find a political frame within which a place as divided as Northern Ireland could have any functional political life. Then in some sense or other, this has a claim to be at least as successful as any of the other attempts to resolve the political conundrums of Ireland and the political conundrums of the North. So I suppose at the very least, this isn't just a historical Memorial Day, it's a chance to reevaluate in some sense what Sunningdale was all about. And for Ulster University to be the host of it is an honour. So thank you to the John and Pat Hume Foundation again. We have a good and close working relationship with the Foundation, and we have done a lot of events together, and this is another of important set of things for us to be seen to doing together. So thanks to him for all your work and the committee. And other than that, I just want to say I think I should listen more than speak, which isn't normally what I do. And I'm handing over to Paul Arthur.
Thanks, Duncan. I just want to welcome everyone here on behalf of the John Pat Hume Foundation, the Heath Foundation and the Department of Foreign Affairs. There are at least 3 events going on around town on this particular topic. I think there's one in the Linhall Library at present, and there's one maybe in Conway Mill, because it was such an important date. And I hope that by the end of the day we'll have a much better understanding of not why it failed, but where we're going. So with that, I think we're going to go into a video, and then we'll have the first session. Thank you.
From Sunningdale in England in December 1973 came an answer that for a moment seemed to promise new hope. An agreement was signed here by the British Prime Minister Edward Heath, together with the government of the Irish Republic and Brian Faulkner of Northern Ireland, to implement an arrangement to share power in Northern Ireland with the SDLP under Gerry Fitt. At the same time, to meet what was called an Irish dimension, a Council of Ireland was to be set up. Catholic members of the SDLP, like Paddy Devlin, while keeping their aim of a united Ireland to be won only by consent, were for the first time to share power at Stormont on behalf of the Catholic minority. The Catholic Austin Currie was to be in charge of housing, sitting together with former Unionist ministers in the Cabinet of Northern Ireland. Gerry Fitt was to be the Deputy Chief Executive opposite Brian Faulkner. What particularly worried Faulkner's fellow Unionists was the Sunningdale proposal for a Council of Ireland.
It's a Council of Ireland which will enable the Dublin government to cooperate with the Belfast government on matters of mutual concern. But it's a Council of Ireland which has absolutely no constitutional responsibilities either in Northern Ireland or in the Irish Republic.
At the British general election of 1974, which was fought in Northern Ireland on Sunningdale, Unionists rallied to the old cause. The election result showed clearly no confidence in Faulkner or Sunningdale.
What have the people of Ulster said? They have said, first of all, to Mr. Faulkner and his cronies, we will have nothing to do with enforced power sharing in any undemocratic government in Stormont. And they have said, with a voice of authority, Mr. Faulkner, the time has come for you to go.
The exact time when Faulkner went was 3 months later, when a body known as the Ulster Workers' Council began a political strike against power sharing and Sunningdale. The centre of Belfast was paralysed by barricades and all transport and normal activity brought to a halt. Power stations had to be taken over by the army. The strike, which had been organised with direct involvement of the UDA, received widespread support from the Protestant Unionist population. The British government capitulated and Sunningdale was abandoned.
Okay, let's get straight into the first session, really on the negotiations for the Sunningdale Agreement. I want to waste as little, I don't want to waste time, so I'm not going to give any long introductions for the speakers. They're all extremely well known, and there's short bios in your material. I'm asking each of the speakers to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I can't guarantee any of this. And it'll go in this order. First, we'll have Sean Donlon, who I think was one of the original, what were known as travellers, who went from Ivy House to the north from the late 60s, early 70s to get a feel for what was going on the ground. And, of course, went on to become the Irish ambassador to the United States and the Secretary General of the Department of Foreign Affairs. And then we'll have Noel Dorr. Sean, I think, will really do what Enoch Powell calls the pre-play, what leads up to the negotiations. Noel, who I think joined Department of Foreign Affairs, incredible. Noel, I should say, is 90 years young, so there's a long career there. All of it, I think, spent in the Department of Foreign Affairs, ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to the United Kingdom, like Sean, Secretary General of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and has had a distinguished career since in the books he's published on Irish politics generally. And finally, Lord Paul Bew, who tells me that he wasn't there when Sunningdale was going on, so he may have nothing to say, but I doubt it. Paul, you know, is, besides a very distinguished academic career, has been a crossbencher in the House of Lords and chaired the Committee on Standards in Public Service for five years or so. So that's the order of speaking, and we start with Sean, and we'll hear 3 speakers before we open it, because if we stop after each one, we won't get too far. Okay, Sean, do you mind starting?
Thank you very much, Paul. 50 years ago today, I went to the Europa Hotel for my breakfast. The then manager, Harper Brown, offered me steak and creme de menthe. He had no milk, he had no water, and The reason he had stake was the electricity had been cut off and everything in his deep freeze had thawed. It was part of my interesting. I spent 7 years from 1971 to 1978 travelling in Northern Ireland, maintaining contact for the Irish government with political and other leaders here. But the 6 months, the 3 or 4 months before Sunningdale and the 3 months after were probably the most exciting times of my diplomatic career. I'd like to begin by referring to individuals whom, in my view, were very significant, very important in making possible what happened. First of all, the relationship between Jack Lynch as Taoiseach and Ted Heath as Prime Minister in 71-72 was crucial. Up to September 71, the British government attitude to Dublin was very simple. Northern Ireland is none of your business. Keep your nose out of it. But in a series of 2 very important meetings, one at the beginning of September, bilateral, and a second meeting at the end of September with Brian Faulkner, Heath had been persuaded that whatever happened in Northern Ireland, Dublin's cooperation would be needed. The second important relationship in my experience was that between Brian Faulkner and Liam Cosgrave, who became Taoiseach in Dublin in 1973. They had an extraordinarily close relationship created by both were interested in horses. First time they met, certainly in my presence, they could talk about nothing else but the difficulty of getting a good harrier to shoe your horses. They also seemed to feel that they both led political parties that included very difficult people. Liam Cosgrave never defined who his difficult people were, but he sympathised with Faulkner and vice versa. There were the 2 relationships. Then 2 individuals. First of all, John Hume. John was like a circus ringmaster. He seemed to have his finger in every negotiation, and he encouraged negotiations when, for example, most of us thought they were not possible. In the middle of the period after the elections in June of 73, the 3 parties, the Unionists, the SDLP and the Alliance Party, had a majority of the seats in the Assembly. So they felt they could at least get into talks to see if they could form a coalition. John was very much at the centre of those negotiations. But at the same time, he was keeping Dublin fully in the loop. And when difficulties arose, he had his own contacts in London behind the scenes where he could go and try and sort things out. And the second individual, I think, of huge importance was the Secretary of State, Whitelaw. Whitelaw's ability, it was a combination of guile and charm, but to be able to sit down as chair of the negotiations, which started at the end of August 1973 and ended at the end of November, he kept the negotiations going pretty well single-handed. There were times when he had to be at Westminster and his permanent Under-Secretary, Frank Cooper, took charge. We in Dublin certainly had less confidence in Cooper. I saw him quite a lot. I had dinner with him one evening and in the middle of these negotiations, and he seemed to be very friendly. But at the end of dinner, he said, "I'm going to ask the British ambassador in Dublin to have you withdrawn from Northern Ireland. You are a menace. You are interfering in our internal affairs." Now, it's a curious position. We diplomats who have worked in Northern Ireland before the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, we had no status. We relied simply on the fact it's a common travel area, we can come and go. The only threat which the British did make in my case twice was, well, we can't guarantee your security. To which my response was, well, there are a lot of people who have died whose security you have not been able to guarantee. They didn't much like that. But anyway, tribute particularly to Secretary of State Whitelaw. The background then to the negotiations. The Troubles had prompted a lot of rethinking in Dublin, in London and in Belfast. In Dublin, the De Valera Frank Aiken policy, the irredentist policy towards Northern Ireland, had been replaced by a more pragmatic approach by Jack Lynch and Paddy Hillary, who had accepted the principle of no change in the status of Northern Ireland without the consent of a majority. In London, I've referred to the change that Heath initiated by accepting that Dublin had a role. And in Belfast, and this has only been fully revealed recently, senior civil servants in Stormont produced 3 secret papers, both for themselves and for the British government, which seriously influenced the formulation of policy. In particular, for example, they invented the concept of, quote unquote, the Irish dimension. Brian Faulkner never wanted to use the word Council of Ireland because it prompted him to think back to the early 1920s, and he advised against it. Pity, possibly a pity we didn't take his advice. Anyway, the British government eventually adopted the policy of power sharing and an Irish dimension. And on that basis, the elections were held in 73, and the negotiations went on from August to the end of November, which led to an outline agreement at Stormont that there would be a power-sharing executive and, in principle, there would be a Council of Ireland. Question then was, particularly for Brian Faulkner, how would he get involved in negotiations with Dublin? He eventually agreed, and this was before the conference in Sunningdale opened, he eventually agreed that if it was possible to set up a very secret meeting, he'd meet anybody representing the then Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave. John Hume was the fixer of that particular meeting. Dermot Nally and myself, Dermot was secretary to the Department of the Taoiseach. We met Brian Faulkner in the middle of October 73 at his house. By the way, he was the most generous, hospitable and friendly host. He invited us to dinner at his house near Downpatrick. I have rarely seen and consumed such excellent wines, even though he himself never touched alcohol. Superb French white, French red. I had to forego. I wasn't driving. Dermot Nally was driving. He couldn't drink very much, but even I had to skip the port because I knew we'd have to do a full report that evening when we got back to Dublin. But he was an extraordinarily generous host. He didn't particularly like the concept. He said, by the way, this was before the agreement had been reached with the SDLP and the Alliance Party. He said, I have no doubt we'll reach agreement. I'm getting on well with John Hume, and John is able to keep his party under control in a way that I am not. He also said, Council of Ireland, yes, we probably have to have something like that. But if we do need to have something like that, it should be as modest as possible. And if possible, it should include responsibility for North-South security cooperation. But he was very, very helpful and friendly. And this despite the fact that 3 days before we met him, he had scraped through a vote of the Ulster Unionist Council. I think the result was 369 to 359. He showed remarkable courage, in my view. He was under attack all the time, but went into Sunningdale with a very positive attitude. The SDLP position was always a little bit easier because I think John Hume had sold his policies to his party, and all of them were committed. So there was no internal dissent. And if there was any dissent, it was who would get what jobs. when the executive was formed. But I'll never forget the day agreement was reached in Stormont. I was camped in a hotel in West Belfast at the time, the Green and Lodge Hotel. Some of you may remember it. And the SDLP assemblymen had assembled there, men and women, and they all ordered champagne and soup and put it on my account. It took me about 6 months to get my own department to pay for it. They said, well, what was the occasion? I couldn't tell them what the occasion was and how important it was. But in any event, there are the main points that I remember from the period before Sunningdale. Noel Dorr, in my view, is the extraordinary recorder of what happened at Sunningdale. I encourage you to go and buy his book on Sunningdale, because in the appendix he actually includes not his daily notes, his hour-by-hour notes of what happened. So the fullest account of Sunningdale is certainly in Noel's book, and I will leave it to him to say exactly what has happened. But I summarize again by saying the principles of Sunningdale have never, ever changed. They are the principles that underline the Good Friday Agreement. Two things, very simple: power sharing and an Irish dimension. And as Seamus Mallon, and he will be frequently quoted, he described the Good Friday Agreement as Sunningdale for slow learners. So I leave that and hand over to Noel Dorr. Thank you very much.
Just before, sort of line of continuity there, I think in your book, Noel, you talk about Sunningdale as being a sort of foundation. The thing, even though it failed, it laid down a foundation for future. And another thing I think that you talked about quite a lot was the notion of community. Two communities in Northern Ireland, and in fact, community, which is usually seen as a benign phrase, can in fact be very malign. And to some extent, all that's followed since 74 has been about how do you deal with that?
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Sean. I'll pay you afterwards for the comment about my book.
10%.
My background, at the time of Sunningdale, I was head of what's called the Press and Information Section in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin. It was closely linked to what we call the Anglo-Irish division, of which Sean was involved. And I was deeply involved in briefing journalists coming from London and so on the Dublin view on the Northern Ireland conflict. Just to pick up, Sean has covered the background very well. I'll just pick up on one point, or emphasize a point, which I think Duncan also said when he opened. That is Sunningdale as a turning point. And to show that, I just give you two quotes, in fact, from 1969, when Dr. Hillary, the Irish Foreign Minister at the time, went to London in August 1969. On the 1st of August, he met Michael Stewart, the Foreign Secretary, to warn about the dangers that looked to be looming over the Apprentice Boys' March on the 12th, because many more bands were coming in, and it promised to be a dangerous time. Stewart, whom he knew from Brussels, was reassuring. Afterwards, of course, trouble did break out very seriously in Derry and Londonderry, if you want to call it that, and later in Belfast. Then Hillary went again to London on the 15th of August and met the Minister of State in the Foreign Office, Lord Chalfont, and the Minister of State in the Home Office, Lord Stoneham, because Stewart was on holidays. Chalfont told him, "It would be improper for me to agree with a representative of the foreign government to take action in the domestic sphere. This is not a situation in which the citizens of Ireland are involved." And on the British record of the same meeting, Chalfont repeated that we would not have consultations with the government of the Republic on the affairs of Northern Ireland. That was 1969. At Sunningdale in 1973, Ted Heath, whom I'll talk about shortly in another way, agreed to a Council of Ireland linking Northern Ireland and the Republic with no British involvement in the Council, except for matters which were of direct concern to them, where they would have to have some kind of role. So the change from 1969, saying it's no business of yours, to 1973, when we have the Sunningdale Agreement, that seems to me to be dramatic, and it justifies what Sean and Duncan have said. I'll talk briefly about the preparation. It went on for quite a long time. I would say, though, that the two ideas of the unsuitability of the Westminster system for a divided community, plus the need for some role that the Republic was not simply a foreign country, but was involved intrinsically in Northern Ireland, not as an external actor, but because a large part of the population in Northern Ireland wanted unity and wanted at least a link with Dublin. So it was intrinsic to the situation. Those two ideas, I think, they may have originated with John Hume, I'm not quite sure. They certainly came from an advisor to old Eamon Gallagher to Jack Lynch, and they were the themes that Lynch stressed to Heath in the preliminary period, and that's what fed into Sunningdale, in my view. There were 9 months of preparation, at least 9 months, I think, from the Green Paper of the end of October 1972 until the Sunningdale Conference. There were high expectations in Dublin of what would be done. There was a sense of a kind of reopening the settlement reached at the treaty in 1920-21. And of course, Garret Fitzgerald's father and Liam Cosgrave's father were both involved in the earlier years of the 1920s. So the further point was Tom Jones, Lloyd George's Deputy Cabinet Secretary at the treaty negotiations, kept a detailed record, and his book was published just about that time. So there was a sense that we're going back to see what went wrong with the treaty settlement in relation to leaving Northern Ireland divided between two communities. So that expectation was perhaps obviously too high, as it turned out, but that was the mood, I think, in Dublin. The venue for the conference was Sunningdale, a civil service training college near London. It was a very large campus with a number of buildings, and the conference took place in the main hall. The press were kept sequestered in another building away from the conference and not released, so to speak, on the delegates until the very end. I just describe the conference timetable rather briefly. It started at a dinner in Downing Street on Wednesday evening, to which the main participants were invited. Sean and I and another colleague, the legal advisor in the Department of Foreign Affairs, were just below the cut-off point for going to the dinner. And we were left in the embassy. And before our ministers had left to go to the dinner, the Taoiseach and his ministers, we were asked to redraft the statement about what became the declarations at Sunningdale about consent and so on. And we were told to soften it a bit. They had quite a time in Downing Street. I believe there was singing, and maybe Paddy Devlin and others were involved. And they came back cock-a-hoop from Sunningdale, still jovial and cheerful. And we showed them our work. And they said, "What were you doing? What are you doing trying to soften this?" So we were blamed for having softened it, although we had sat dinnerless in the embassy for 4 hours at their request to try to soften the text. I'll pass on very quickly. The communique, we'll probably be talking a bit about that later. I could tell you that there are 20 paragraphs in it, that there's this two declarations about the future. This has to be explained. They were printed in the text, in Dublin at least, in parallel, so as to show that one was not prior to the other. There was what the Irish government said and what the British government said. And essentially what the British government said is Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom and that cannot be changed without consent. What the Irish government said is Northern Ireland, the future will, the consent to Northern Ireland is for the future is that there will be no unity in Ireland without consent. But nobody in the Irish, there was nothing in the Irish side to say that Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. Furthermore, the British text, if you look very closely at it, talked about the majority of the population in Northern Ireland. The Irish text talked about a majority of the population in Northern Ireland. And that's the way subtleties carried through into an international agreement. The majority in Northern Ireland could imply the Unionists. A majority in Northern Ireland would imply and clearly say a majority of the population. So there's a great deal of subtlety and some what I would call political theology built into the text. I'll move on from that to say that the question of extradition, a very vexed question, had to be left and deferred to a commission which was set up with 3 or 4 distinguished lawyers from London and 3 or 4 distinguished equivalents from Dublin. And they examined the various possibilities of common courts and so on for dealing with that issue of extradition, with which the Irish government had difficulties because they claimed it was, we claimed in Dublin, that it was a principle of international law that there would be no extradition for political offences. The commission, anyway, was given the task of looking at the various possibilities. And by the most amazing coincidence, they agreed on everything except extradition, where 4 distinguished lawyers from London said it's not contrary to international law, and 4 distinguished lawyers from Dublin said it is. So if you ever were giving a lecture to legal students studying law, I'd ask them to write an essay on the question of legal impartiality and reflect the 2 positions, one pro and one contrary, on an issue of international law. I'll move on pretty quickly, I'm aware of time. A key thing to remember about the Sunningdale Agreement is that it was not the final word. It was agreed that there would be a formal conference later. The reason for that was that the functions of a Council of Ireland had to be sorted out. And particularly, the Irish government had been insisting that it should have executive functions as well as consultative and harmonising functions. So it was decided to defer that until, it said optimistically, of course, early in the new year. There'd be a formal stage of the conference. The thing would be then signed as a treaty. It would be registered at the United Nations. That never happened. And that's an important factor in thinking about Sunningdale. I'll go on to why did it fail? Or why was it not accepted and not tolerated in the end by the Unionists? I think there was a series of unfortunate external aspects that went wrong. There was an election called in February. Ted Heath, who was deeply involved in Sunningdale, and he was a very benign chairman of the conference trying to get agreement, he lost office. Wilson came to office. It wasn't his agreement. He wasn't against it, but it wasn't his agreement. There was that change of government and a new Prime Minister in London. Then there was a need to sell Sunningdale, to say this is the answer. And Faulkner needed to sell it in Northern Ireland, and Cosgrave needed to sell it in the south. Faulkner was in deep trouble with his party, and understandably, he was defensive, saying what we didn't give away, whereas the need was to go out and say what we have achieved, what we have gained, what we have done. In Dublin, Liam Cosgrave, the Taoiseach, was blocked by an action by Fianna Fáil dissident Kevin Boland in the courts, declaring that it was contrary to the Irish Constitution. So he was stopped by the lawyers from going out and selling the thing. And when the case came to court, in the High and Supreme Court, the lawyers for the government had to take a position which said, played it down, said that this is, after all, is nothing much. It's not contrary to the Constitution. Whereas the need was to go out and sell it, saying this is a chance for peace at last. I won't labour that point too much. I'd say that another factor was the violence continued, of course. And I think Ed Maloney, in his book on the IRA, says that there was a plan to blow up a ship in Dublin, in Belfast Lough. I'm not quite sure of the details of that. The Ulster worker strike is an obvious factor, and Rees's response was weak. And the key thing, I think, is that, as I said, it was only the first stage. So the judgment in the election here in Northern Ireland on what was done was made at an early and imperfect stage in the settlement. If there had been time, a year or so, the fears might have dissipated, if not dissipated, at least been reduced on the side of the unionist community. But to be asked to make a judgment just on the spot within a month or two of the agreement, I think was very unfortunate. Just two more points, and I realise that Paul may be about to tell me I'm due to stop. I think it's already been emphasised by Duncan, the important legacy, the principle that the two governments work together, that both nationalist and unionist agendas are legitimate, the need for some degree of assurance to the unionists, which was not adequately provided in Sunningdale in the joint declarations, but which has now come in the Good Friday Agreement through the referenda, the concurrent referenda and the change in the Irish Constitution. The talk of parity of esteem, and then the general idea of not trying to decide now between the rival agendas of the two communities, but leaving it to time, over time, to work through power sharing and people learning to work together, and then perhaps in another generation making a judgment. I think that was an idea which is sort of carried through. I will finish with this kind of contrast between the different efforts at a settlement. And I see the three main ones was Sunningdale, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. At Sunningdale, the idea was build from the centre, create some kind of a settlement, and that will induce people to come in from the fringes, people who might be engaged in violence. Build from the centre was the general idea. The Anglo-Irish, it involved the two key elements, power sharing and an Irish dimension, two key elements from the point of view of the Irish government in any case. The Anglo-Irish Agreement, I think in the May of 1985, Chris Patton, a junior minister in the Northern Ireland office at the time, did a tour trying to see if there would be agreement on power sharing, and it was rejected. And I think that was relevant to the fact that the two governments then took, so to speak, command in the Anglo-Irish Agreement and set up all the structures of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, but with provision for power sharing and for regional government in Northern Ireland when and if that was agreed. I come now to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and the way I see it is that two key things had happened over the period. One was the people involved in conflict had grown older. They'd aged. They were still there fighting at this stage. So there was a need, if you like, to find some kind of settlement. The Anglo-Irish Agreement, in my view, I know this would be disputed, but paradoxically, it had an effect in both sides of the conflict. I think it helped to show the IRA that there was another way forward, a better way forward. And the Hume-Adams dialogue and so on tried to sustain that. On the unionist side, my view of it is that they hated it so much as a diktat that they were now open to some new way forward. They were looking for something, some alternative to this horrible Anglo-Irish Agreement, if you want to call it that. And the Brooke-Mayhew talks in the early 90s began that process of finding the way forward, which resulted in the peace process. But the key thing, I think, that made a big difference was the Hume proposal for concurrent referenda to settle the issue. That allowed the contentious problem of the two agendas and the rivalry between them for the political future of Northern Ireland to be taken out of the immediate and left for the future. So then it was possible, that plus the fact that the combatants, if you want to call it that, were that much older and weary, and the two other factors I talked about carried forward, seems to me, momentum into the Good Friday Agreement. So the way it was done there, instead of building from the centre to the extremes, was to go and consult the extremes in all sorts of talks and contacts behind the scenes, and then gradually draft something which could be a basis for the end of violence, and then put it all together at a conference of the Good Friday and Belfast Agreement in 1998. So that seems to me the key history. Now, I want to finish by simply saying I'm talking from a Dublin viewpoint. I realise I may be talking to people who think very differently of this. I'm just trying to give you a flavour of the way I would see it from a Dublin point of view. And forgive me if I've gone beyond that in some of the things that you might want to criticise me for when we finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Paul, I'll pass over to you now.
Thanks, Paul. As Paul said earlier, I'm the fraud here in the sense that in 1974, I was in Cambridge working on my PhD. But in 1972, when Stormont fell, I remember going up, I was with Anne Devlin. Do you remember the big speech of Faulkner? And we went up and spent the afternoon in Paddy Devlin's office in 1972. And after the fall of the 1974 executive, I did talk to Paddy a lot in the early 80s and went through a lot of stuff. And so I have some sense of some of the things that went on in the executive. And of course, he did publish on it as well later. But I want to start in 1972. The truth is, the day of direct rule, Whitelaw said to close ally, United Ireland is the only way out of this. This is the context you really have to get very clear in your mind. The Central Policy staff in number 10 in September 71 said the fact that Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom is of no more relevance than the fact that Algeria was once a part of France, and a document prepared for Edward Heath. And it's, everybody knows Faulkner's view that basically Bloody Sunday was a British Army mistake, and that was, but the Ulster Unionists would pay the price for it in the coming of direct rule. But the reason why I'm mentioning these things is partly, of course, by the way, you will all have noticed 50 years later, United Ireland still hasn't come, and never has, sometimes I feel like Lord Melbourne about, his famous thing about O'Connell. He says that some things all the bright people are right about and all the damn fools are, all the right people say one thing and all the damn fools say another. And it turns out the damn fools were right. It was the damn fool group who said that the union will still be around 50 years from now. I can't give you an answer as to why that's so, except it's a comment, obviously, on not just unionist resistance, but Republican strategy and also the quite intentional strategies of the Irish government. Now, by way of background to what Noel has just said, it's very important to understand one thing. The DFA was well aware that in 1925 they had signed an international agreement, tripartite international agreement, which fully and unambiguously recognises Northern Ireland's place as part of the United Kingdom in an international agreement, and that the Irish Constitution, which is why various things happened, such as the legal defence, the tone of the legal defence that Noel has referred to, was not actually international law. And they knew that this was not a case. If the British government choose to say, sorry, oh boy, 1925, you signed up. The view in the DFA was you wouldn't have a leg to stand on. British government never did. And this constant game, which Noel has accurately described, of saying, well, you can't really reassure the unionists in the sort of language that should have been used in 74 about consent, the status of Northern Ireland, it continued, and it continued right up to the Good Friday Agreement. Even the framework document is not an unambiguous statement of a dropping of a territorial claim by Ireland. But it is quite important to understand the choice was made. Everybody knew in the DFA what the 1925 agreement meant. So to some degree, the ambiguity is self-inflicted. And the fact that the British didn't care enough is also very revealing to ever actually, as far as I'm aware, nobody actually bothered to to actually say, excuse me, what's all this about the Irish Constitution of 37? Constitution 37 is a domestic document. That's all it is. It's not international law. It's domestic rhetoric, essentially. And I think these things are quite important if you're looking at this, because coming back to Seamus Mallon's great description, which is, I think, largely right, and I know it's not entirely right, more stuff on equality and the Good Friday Agreement, but it was Sunningdale for slow learning. In substance, it was Sunningdale for slow and I you know, not all details, but in substance, it's entirely right. And let's talk to the other thing, which you heard Faulkner talk about on the screen, about the Council of Ireland, where he tried to say it wasn't a big problem, areas of mutual concern and so on. Those phrases, mutual concern and so on, are in the Good Friday Agreement. It's exactly the same formula, essentially. Faulkner says in his memoirs about the Council of Ireland, if this necessary nonsense was something I had to agree to bring the SDLP along, the Irish dimension, then I was going to agree to the necessary nonsense. There was very few unionists, as you could see from that film, who thought it was anything was necessary nonsense. They obviously believed it was something like a dagger to the heart, which tells you something about the political culture of unionism. But he was absolutely confident. And I would say, looking at the period since 1998, we've had many troubles with the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. Everybody knows in this room, decommissioning, delaying things, blah, blah, blah. Everybody knows in this room all the troubles. You know what's never been a problem? The North-South arrangements as such. The nearest they have been to a problem is with this more recent ideological trope, now no longer in the Windsor framework, that there is a thing called the island economy, which requires everybody to work, which is back to a threatening concept to unionists. And we're now back to the traditional correct position, two economies cooperating together, which incidentally was the Irish government's position at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, not just the British government's. So basically, apart from the difficulties we've had in the last few years, North-South cooperation has been surprisingly painless. And there is something in Faulkner's demeanour in that interview, in his book, which is that some long-term sense is wise. He knows that this is doable, this is not going to be the problem. But let's not forget, and again it's been mentioned, the general election. When I was among those struggling to keep unsuccessfully David Trimble afloat at the early part of this century after the Good Friday Agreement, we were only struggling against, the bad moment came when Frank Miller, the great Irish Times political correspondent, said Trimble is no longer, and I've even forgotten what electoral test it was, 2001, the majority shareholder in unionism. Trimble is no longer, because the electoral tide was going against him, leading eventually to his collapse and his replacement by the DUP as the lead party in unionism. This was as nothing to what Faulkner said. The vote against the Sunningdale was a majority of the, taking both communities together, if you add it up, in Northern Ireland. It's not a majority of unionists, it's a majority of people vote for anti-Sunningdale candidates of the entire electorate in the election of 74. It's a massive, massive rejection. That's why, you know, the army believed that this experiment was bound to fade and fail, and that's why they didn't do as much as many nationalists believe they should have done to break the strike, because they thought it was bootless. They thought this was a failing concept anyway, and it's important. Whether that's self-justification, it is a bit, but nonetheless, they did think it was bootless and pointless after the election result. So what I'm trying to say is the landslide against Faulkner makes the trend against Trimble, you know, it's huge. And the Trimble, we were actually, and indeed that's partly why we could continue to battle on into 2003, 2004, because we didn't think we were confronted by that scale of rejection in the unionist community that Faulkner had actually faced. The election is very, very important. And Noel's point is also important. Harold Wilson had no particular affection for this deal. It's enormously, I think, to Heath's credit, Chris McCabe asked Paul and I, both worked as historical advisors to the Bloody Sunday Tribunal, and both of us, I think, agree that what the Cabinet Papers reveal is that whoever is guilty for Bloody Sunday, it's not Everett Heath. in terms of the British state. The cabinet conclusions are very clear on it. Didn't stop being beaten up in court here by Michael Lavery during this tribunal. I actually said to Robert Armstrong once, sitting beside me loads of time, a bit embarrassed. I know that Heath was totally innocent, and there he was every day in the weight being hammered. You're responsible for this atrocity, and this just tells you what happens to old people. And Robert Armstrong turned to me and he said, "Oh, don't feel embarrassed," he said. Heath by that time was so fed up being ignored by everybody that he actually quite enjoyed this performance with Lavery in court, because Lavery was treating him as a historic personage. It happens, and I have some sympathy for it, but Wilson had no such affection or engagement with this process. And Wilson had no unionist leanings either. Wilson believed fundamentally, Bernard Donahue, whom I've become friendly with, but first said this to me at the Centre of Contemporary British History seminar 20 years ago. When he was Prime Minister, Wilson had no interest in any public matter, whether Britain did or did not have an incomes policy. That was the big economic policy issue. They couldn't care less. Whether Britain was or was not in the European Union, or whatever it was then called, couldn't care less either way. But he did believe Britain should get out of Ireland. And that was his, and that is, so what that strike did was open up the road to all the things that Dublin officials found dismaying, secret talks with the provost and so on. Frank Cooper involved in those talks that you have mentioned, and so on. And the strike opened up a totally different agenda of withdrawal or leading into withdrawal by the then Prime Minister. It starts to come to an end because of the intervention of the Irish government. And Donahue tells me the day that he was sitting in his office. Donahue is second generation out of Kerry. His father was a Kerry man. A Kerry man rings up Dermot Nally. And Dermot Nally says, "We hear you are thinking of something very radical." And Donahue says, "Yes, aren't you pleased?" Yeah, and to which Dermot Nally says, "No, we are not." And this is very premature. And indeed, there's a paper from Dermot Nally published since then saying there is no price too high that the Irish government should not pay to keep Britain in Northern Ireland. And that's a very calm and a very clear and intelligent man. There is no price too high not to keep Britain in Northern Ireland. So what happened is that the people who launched this strike against the executive had no capacity themselves, no political unity, no strategy of any sort. What they did was open the door to a British Prime Minister who wanted to explore getting out. And to a very large degree, I think there were other people in the cabinet who thought this was slightly crazy of Wilson, but to a very large degree, the people who launched the strike were actually dependent on the Irish government to impose a certain common sense on British policy. And that, seems to me one of the most important things to say about that period, the unintended consequences of politics. And I just want to conclude by saying that I wasn't there. I feel a fraud. I have been thinking, however, for a long time about what actually happened. Talked a lot to Paddy about it. And I think that we need to think seriously about it, because we need to think what it is that makes a power sharing plus Irish dimension work. Because James Mallon was quite right. Only a power sharing plus Irish dimension will work for this part of Ireland.
Thank you, Paul. And that's been a fascinating discussion. The trouble is we only have about 10 or 15 minutes. Can I just make one point? What Paul says, context is incredibly important when you compare 74 with 85 with 98. If you take 74, if you take the Heath government, I mean, Heath at the time, his interests really were Europe, Northern Ireland and prices and incomes policy. And he was under tremendous pressure. Unionism at that stage was very, very divided. The SALP were in a strong position. I think what Oliver Napier said about Sunningdale was that he blamed Hume and Garrett because they pushed too hard. They were in that position. And so the question about how you negotiate is important. But the second point about context is the international dimension. The difference between 74, which was very much really conducted domestically, with the exception of Europe. The K. D'Orsay papers, when the UK was trying to enter into Europe, raised questions about Northern Ireland. But beyond that, there wasn't much concern really what went on. Whereas if you take, I cannot imagine 98 having come to fruition had you not taken the international dimension into consideration. But having said that, can we throw it open to the floor for questions, comments, and can I ask people to be very brief? And if you could introduce yourselves as well.
Alan Leonard, Managing Editor of Shared Future News. Paul, you mentioned about the 1925 treaty having international status. Could you just share with us some comments about the 1920 Government of Ireland Act? And was it, or for anyone to respond to that in regards to, was it any part of discussions in the Sunningdale talks? Because it certainly was when we came to Good Friday Agreement talks. Thanks.
Couple of, we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then we'll go to the speakers.
Thank you, John McAllister. I suppose dairy farmer now, was involved in politics, and I suppose one of my always my abiding memories of my first big event in Stormont, and I see a few former colleagues here, was probably watching Martin McGuinness, Ian Paisley, Bertie Hare and Tony Blair coming down the stairs, and for someone of my generation wondering what was it all for when I watched some of the video before this. Probably the theme I would like to just ask, particularly Paul, about was around how the 1974 election, the February 74 election, really got in the way of of Sunningdale. A wee bit more about that dynamic around the 11 members of Parliament returned at that election and were very opposed to Sunningdale, the difficulties that caused. Had Heath managed to get it over the line? And bizarrely, of course, that was the first election that the political parties were getting quite separate from UK mainland parties, if you think of the 1970 election. So a wee bit more just around what might have happened had Heath have won that election. Would we have been in a very different place? Or indeed, had Wilson provided a more robust response to the workers' strike?
Can we take one more and then we'll pass it to the panel?
Thanks very much. Neil McCann, I'm in law, been involved in dialogue work, and former Mayor of Dundalk many, many years ago, the year of the ceasefires, which still brings a tear to the eye. Question is, in visualising where the future may go, and it seems we're in a position of volatility, is there an implication in what Seamus Mallon and others may have said that if the border poll were to happen within, say, the 10-year period or even possibly sooner, does that mean that power sharing has to be brought upon? I was tempted to say the word inflicted, but should that be a feature? Or, and I mean, I've written also on other mechanisms that are available to protect the unionist folk. So just this one question, would we be inflicted with power sharing in the event of governance of the whole island?
Paul, can we start with you?
Well, okay, I'll try and do this. On the last question, Niels, my personal view is that the Good Friday Agreement technically could be a document that governs a United Ireland. I actually don't think it can. It puts too much strain on any Irish government. It wouldn't be able to meet the responsibilities. British government's got broad shoulders, lots of money, lots of options, and not that much skin in the game. The commitment to equality of esteem, and by the way, it isn't quite equality of esteem, but this makes it harder for the Irish government. If you read the international agreement, the last sentence of that passage, which is always quoted, it also says that the government which has sovereign power must avoid, I'm now paraphrasing, but this is what it means, must avoid the alienation of one community or the other. My personal view, for example, is that that's exactly what the British government did when it introduced the Irish Language Act at Westminster, and I think it's also what it did when it negotiated safeguarding the Union to get the Unionists back into the executive. And people who say it's not the Good Friday Agreement just have not read the full passage that's there. But I think this is all too much for an Irish government. I really do. I think what a British government is able to do, we're just going to have a new constitution. I'll just be honest. I think the safeguards or whatever, implicitly they're there and should guard a new negotiation. But then the Irish government would just look at the problem the Irish government now has with a few hundred migrants. I'm sorry, I mean, this is as of nothing in the event that there is democratic union. So there will have to be a new set of rules. And I don't know what they are, but I understand completely the very decent impulse which makes people say the Good Friday Agreement is a minority right defences thing and therefore might be used to the Unionists someday. As an impulse, that's excellent, but there have to be some entirely new text to deal with the complicated situation that may arise. Government of Ireland Act. It was an issue in 1920. It was a big issue, and the Government of Ireland was an issue in 1998 because certain sections of that act were removed. To remove the element of British claim, unilateral claim to sovereignty, and replace it with a stronger commitment to the consent principle. And I think that was actually the right thing to do. The Government of Ireland Act also played in recent events. I just want to say something very simple. In view of this tedious argument about trade in Northern Ireland, it's a simple matter of fact that trade matters are for the UK Parliament. There never was a strong beat of any sort. And Unionist MPs, for example, in the debates in 1938, when they don't like the Anglo-Irish Trade Agreement of that year, fully accept, nonetheless, it's this Parliament's ability. This Parliament has the right to make the decision. And it's the argument that the agreement and the commitment to equality of esteem and so on, the safeguards covered trade, isn't true. It covers a lot of other things. It doesn't actually, the agreement of 1998 does not cover or amended. It doesn't, it covers a lot of things, but not actually the trade matters. People have tried to expand it outwards to say, and it's been, because it's created a bogus use of the Good Friday Agreement in recent years, when in fact there are real points in the Good Friday Agreement which should have been part of the debate and were not properly part of the debate in pursuit of a non-point, a non-issue. And finally, John's point about 1970, well, I've already tried to make the point. Faulkner's electoral tide against him. What we struggle against with David Trimble was half that, half the problem. That's why, by the way, we were able to carry on for a while. That's why we looked the other way from certain election results and so on. That's why he won again and again. I think there were 9, we used to call them lawyer Yaga, Ulster Unionist councils. 9, and there were, I think there were 9 altogether before he lost, and they were all quite narrowly decided. So the weight against Trimble was big, and in the end swept him away. But always there was a very large minority of the Unionist population which thought he was basically right. Faulkner was not in the position. Time that he fell, there was not a large majority in the Unionist population. Now, I've said what would have happened had the Irish government said, well, we signed a 1925 agreement. We're not going to worry about a 1937 constitution. Very difficult. Therefore, no problem about extradition. Therefore, no problem about the consent principle. We will actually spell it out in a way that wasn't done until 1998. Would that have cut into Unionist resentment in 74? It's a really, I regard there's no point talking about it now. It's all water under the bridge. But that is one of the questions that are open to consideration. Had the Irish government made the offer that it made in 1998, and it's essentially, as many people have said, but very much the same deal, could we have done better? But to be absolutely honest, I think that election, its timing and so on, I just think Faulkner's never coming back from that. Never coming back from that. And the experience with Trimble is what makes you think of it. We struggled with election results half as bad as that.
No. Some very quick, is the microphone on? Yeah, some very quick comments. The 1920 Act, my memory is that when Albert Reynolds came to office in around 1993, he said in a very early speech about repealing the Government of Ireland Act 1920, my reaction was, where on earth did that come from? What's that all about? I don't mean to say that I was ignorant of the 1920 Act, but the fact that he referred to the Act, which was, in a way, if you like, the Partition Act. It was the one that divided into a Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, two home rule entities. But the fact that he mentioned the Act as distinct from the partition, which of course was common talk, interested me. And where did he get that? Because he wasn't a man who would have been thinking a lot about the 1920 Act before he came to office. So that, I think, was the first mention of it. Secondly, I'm going to give very quick-fire comments on some of the things I've heard. The EU was a model. Very much that was in people's minds, certainly Gareth Fitzgerald's minds, the idea of functional cooperation leading to peace. That was very much the idea in 1973. And of course, John Hume would have been very strong on that also. Thirdly, Ted Heath. I think he deserves great credit. He was a very benign chairman. The Irish side in the beginning were looking for a neutral chairman. You couldn't have asked for someone better than Heath. Afterwards, when I was ambassador in London, I had Heath to dinner, and my wife and I were entertained by Heath to dinner in his house in Salisbury. And he was disconsolate at the time, of course. Margaret Thatcher had come to office. This was the early 1980s. But he attached great importance to Sunningdale, and he felt it was a very sad thing that he was very sad about it, let me put it that way, morose about it. But let me go on very quickly. The Council of Ireland, the first mention, I think, at least Brian Faulkner in his memoirs, I think in the last sentence of the epilogue, he says that he was the first one to suggest a Council of Ireland, that the Unionist Party was under him was the first one to suggest a Council of Ireland, reviving the old idea from the 1920-21 settlement. Of course, he would have emphasised that it was to be on security matters. I don't mean to say that he wanted the Council, that it was actually envisaged. Thirdly, on the Council itself, in my view, and at the time and now I think, the key would have been power sharing. But the Council of Ireland was a necessary prop because the SDLP and the Irish government would not agree to a settlement without the Irish dimension. But over time, what would bring the change was power sharing, as we thought. And the trouble was that afterwards, when the work was being done, preparing for the second stage, there was a committee set up in Dublin of civil servants who had not been involved at all. And they came up with a huge and monstrous proposal of all the functions of a Council of Ireland. That was not political policy, and it wasn't really accepted, but they were let loose, so to speak, on the task. And if this is the task we're given to think of functions, let's put down as many as we can think of. Two other quick comments. The Constitution of 1937, Paul has referred to. Of course, it was an obstacle. Of course, it was seen as irredentist and so on. But it was very subtle in its time. It posed a theory that the national territory was the whole island of Ireland. But then it said, in practice, it withdrew to be the jurisdiction pending the reintegration of the national territory. The jurisdiction was the 26 counties. It was a subtle kind of theological attempt, if you like. A philosopher would talk about potency and act. It was a united Ireland in potency, but in act it was actually the 26 counties. I think that's the 1925 agreement that Paul has talked about. That followed the breakdown of the Boundary Commission. And certainly the position of the Free State government and the tripartite talks, which I think were probably the last equivalent to what happened at Sunningdale, where the position of the Free State government was quite abject. It was more or less saying, help us, come up with something for us. I mean, I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's the way you'll see it in the documents. What was agreed was, as Paul says, an agreement, but Fianna Fáil and Sean Lemass and Jack Lynch would never have accepted that because De Valera was not he was outside the walls at the time. He had not entered the Dáil, and they always regarded that as not valid. It wasn't really approved by a proper Irish Parliament. You can talk about that as you wish, but that was that's the theory, at least, as Fianna Fáil saw it afterwards. I think that's all I've got to say.
Sean. Okay, I think, look, we could use this one session for the whole day, but others have to come, so we better give them their space. This morning I had Leslie Morrell on Radio Ulster. He's the only living member of the executive in 74. And it's interesting that in the room today we have 3 people whose relatives at least were very closely involved. Anne Devlin's father, Paddy, obviously. Bríd Napier's husband, Oliver, and Emer Curry's father, Austin. So I just want to acknowledge their presence here today and to move on to the next session. Thank you.
I don't know about you, but I found that last session absolutely fascinating. So thanks to Sean and to Noel and to Paul and to the other Paul for chairing so well. We could have really listened to everyone all day. We could have gone on for a long time, people reminiscing. So you're very welcome to the next session. My name's Purvis and I'm Vice Chair of the Hume Foundation. And I have some very special guests with me this afternoon. I'm not going to go into long bios because, as Paul said previously, we could be here probably the rest of the day. I'm going through the list of achievements of the people here beside me. So I'll start off with Eileen Weir, who's a community activist on the Shankill Road. Eileen's worked in the community all her life and probably best known for her work with Shankill Women's Centre. Next to Eileen, we have Hugh Logue. Hugh, as many of you will know, was a long-term member, founder member of the SDLP and served in the 1973 Assembly. So thanks for joining us, Hugh. Hugh's also a member of the Hume Foundation Board. Next to Hugh, we have Chris McCabe. I first met Chris in, I think it was 1995, when Chris was working in the NIO at the time. Chris has led a very distinguished career in the civil service, and he's here because of his knowledge of what happened during Sunningdale. He was private secretary to Brian Faulkner. And lastly, but by no means least, we have Geoff Martin. Geoff, I met many moons ago at the old EU Commission office in Bedford Street, which many of you will remember was at on the ground floor of Windsor House at the time. Geoff was our EU representative, and then was the UK representative to the EU Commission. So you're all very welcome. I'm going to start off with Hugh to set a bit of context, Hugh, if you would, around the Assembly.
Well, thank you, Don. And you've been a terrific chairman of the Hume Foundation, and we're delighted that you've been able to carry that for the number of years that you have. Perhaps the context then, there was a great sense of optimism and hopefulness, I think, about it. Partnership was overcoming conflict, replacing conflict, well, at least physical conflict. I was very taken recently by Ben Lowry, that is one editor of one of the papers here, and he was in the Royal Irish Academy. And Ben was born in the United States, but as an infant, he recalled that he was brought back to Northern Ireland in the first months of January 1974. And so when that very political Ben Lowry confronted as a teenager, confronted his children and said, "What the hell were you doing? What kind of madness was it that you brought us back to Northern Ireland from the United States, from Maine in the United States in 1974? His parents, who were both medics, said, "It was the beginning of a bright new future. We all thought it was going to happen." And he, I think, captured the mood of that time. The economy was on the upturn. We had just joined the EU, and John Hume, within a few weeks, would open the office in Brussels, make a huge impression, bilingual, and Basil McIver brought forward the first bill on shared school legislation. And I think a sense of that time as well, and a barometer of it, was Cecil Lenihan was starting up All Children Together. So there was that kind of optimism, a bright future beckoned, and Brian Faulkner in those early days thought that the new normality, as he called it, would be established within 2 years. The thing would bear down. But within a few months, there was increased tension. There was real fear on the streets. We were under death threats. Our houses, mine and many other of the public representatives at the time, the Devlins and others, were being fitted with bulletproof glass. The RUC were offering to Assembly members personal protection weapons. I declined one, John Hume declined one, on the basis that to carry a weapon basically was an inherent act of violence. But many of my colleagues, Ivan Cooper, Paddy Duffy, Tom Daly, Vincent McCluskey, all of them accepted weapons because they felt that they needed them. My wife was posted a wreath with my name on it at the time. Those were the kind of things that had suddenly became very, very hostile. And both the IRA and the UVF declared that ministers were legitimate targets. Can you imagine that? A bomb was discovered in the Donlon in a short time, where the SDLP Assembly and Executive were to meet, a short time before the meeting was about to begin. The IRA carried on their murder campaign. So you had gone from that huge optimism dawn within at the end of 1973 and the first few months of 1974 to this tense dread that violence was again on the up and that it could be much more widespread. I assume the downfall of the executive and the collapse by Wilson, or the failure of the Wilson administration, you'll come to that later, I assume. Okay.
Thanks, Hugh. Chris, you were private secretary to Brian Faulkner at the time. Do you think Brian Faulkner had that optimism turned sour afterwards?
Thank you, Dawn, and for your kind remarks earlier. I was one of Brian Faulkner's private secretaries. He actually had 3 as ministers to British ministers in Northern Ireland office ministers. Although Jerry Fitt only had 1, but as chief minister, Brian was entitled to 3, and I was one of those 3. I want to put a little bit of this into just tell you how I developed in these things and how some of the things I saw as a fly on the wall. And indeed, some people on occasions have called me the Forrest Gump of Northern Ireland because only not so bright, over many, many years I was there. But this is how to the end of my career, was very committed to what I was doing, and that was bringing about something like ultimately the restoration of power to Northern Ireland. I started off as a researcher in the Northern Ireland Cabinet Office. A research unit was set up. It was a covert organisation. It was really, it was something that the view was that civil servants shouldn't be appointed there and shouldn't be working on it, but nevertheless, 3 of us were. The first 2 papers I wrote, and this was still in 1971, the end of 71, still a unionist government, with Brian Faulkner as Prime Minister, SDLP Contradictions. And I had a team that went out and looked through every newspaper they could find to find contradictions in the SDLP, wrote that up into a headline paper, which was then turned into a speech and delivered by a unionist minister. The next one, a couple of weeks later, was Social Security benefits North and South, why it's much better to live in Northern Ireland. So that wasn't, I was doing what I was told. I was new, novel, and it was quite exciting to work in the Cabinet Office. I wasn't planning to stay, even as a civil servant, but it showed me something of the mentality of unionism at that time. The SDLP, big enemy in a political sense, and the Irish government and the Social Security matter was one of them. I was also sent out and about to observe things like the March 1972 Vanguard protest in the Ormeau Park, where up to 60,000 people marched about in the style of a Nuremberg rally, which is what I wrote in my report, and I recently saw it coming out in the archives, but nobody seems to mind it anymore. it was quite scary to see that, and that was what unionism was thinking, or some elements of it. When Willie Whitelaw's helicopter arrived not long afterwards on the lawn outside Stormont Castle, I thought my career was ended. But I was first gobbled up into his private office as a junior private secretary, shuffling papers. And then the research unit that I'd be a member of was reconstituted with the three of us again to do similar work, but not of the propaganda nature, for the British government, for the new direct rule. Some of the work was involved. London colleagues did most of it, but some of it, I should say, by the stage I'd been fully incorporated in as a member of the Northern Ireland office. A green paper of October 1972 was the first to float very extensive proposals for Northern Ireland. That was followed by a white paper with much more in it, expanded on the green paper, and had novel things like the EU dimension that would have to be recognised in any Northern Ireland settlement. There was concern. It also had the establishment of basic north-south arrangements. So these were being cradled in papers before even Sunningdale. Another rather dramatic step that didn't actually go down as badly as we thought was a statement that the position of Governor of Northern Ireland would be abolished. The Secretary of State was very worried that this would be offensive to the Governor. He would be very upset. So my boss and I were asked to deliver the day before a copy of the white paper to him and explain exactly what was going on. It was also decided that the copies of the paper should be available the day it was published, right across Northern Ireland, and lorries were sent out with a policeman in each one because the Secretary of State wanted it guarded. He was scared that someone would hijack it on its way and embarrass everyone. Were taken out and left in social security offices right across Northern Ireland where people could read it. Whenever my boss and I got to the Governor, he was actually very relaxed about it. His private secretary was very upset. I think he saw his job gone. But the Governor, as an experienced diplomat, and what you would expect, shrugged his shoulders and said, that's it. I think he had some clue of it. Interestingly, many, many years later, oh gosh, 8, 9, 10 years ago, I was asked by the British government to go out to Zanzibar, where there was a problem between themselves as a devolved institution of Tanzania. Their Constitution Act, their current Constitution Act, was based entirely on our 1973 Constitution Act with power sharing and the relationship central and local. So it helped to bring peace there. There was danger of some sort of conflict. It worked. We were also writing papers on possible ways forward. Unity was one, a paper we produced. Redrawing the border was another one. And a condominium, which I've never really fully understood the meaning of that, but that's what was one of the things we put in. And independence for Northern Ireland. They've all been brought out in later years by other people. When Brian Faulkner, whenever, this is not Sunningdale, because my closeness to Sunningdale was taking some papers out in a rush that someone had left behind. That was as close as I got, but I was obviously familiar with it. But I wanted to set some of the detail. I was then appointed Brian Faulkner's, one of his private secretaries. We were located in Parliament buildings in an office shared with Jerry Fitz, private secretary, which I thought was very significant. Jerry was on one side of us, and we were in the private office, and Brian Faulkner was on the other. Very different from some other devolution settings we had over the years where there was a separation. But that little group worked very, very closely together. And I was much impressed with the relationships that were built up during that period between the parties. Something that I don't think has made many of the headlines, but on the 4th of January, only 4 days after the executive was up, the Ulster Unionist Council had a vote. And we all know what that vote declared, that there were 422 427 against and 373 for. But there was a snag. The telephone had rung. We were waiting. The executive was sitting downstairs waiting for the results with bated breath. Brian Faulkner believed, I believe he believed he was actually going to win it. There was a belief, and the executive seemed to optimism prevailed. The phone rang. There's a grin from my principal private secretary, Sinclair Duncan. He went like that. Rushed downstairs. Cheers came from the Cabinet Office. We could hear them in the office. I was there with my colleague John Walker and Tom Roberts, who was Director of Information. Cheers from downstairs. 2 minutes later, the phone rang again. I answered and it said, "Oh, I got it wrong. It's the other way round." The kindly Tom Roberts saw the colour draining from my face and said, "Don't worry, Chris, I'll go down and tell them." I just thought that was one of the most dreadful things, and the person that got it wrong for many, many years could never look me straight in the face. But it was one of those things. I would like to say it was as close as that, but unfortunately it wasn't. But nevertheless, these are little anecdotes that show you. The executive was wonderful. It taught me an awful lot about the cooperation that was going on and between the whole assembly and people like you. It was great to see and watch. And I was particularly struck by the presence in the Cabinet of Paddy Devlin, who in his own admission had been an internee, had been a leader of the IRA in the 1940s in Belfast, and was accepted almost without question by unionists. When I heard later, 30 years later, complaints about who was in Cabinet and who was serving and who was in the Assembly, I always thought back to Paddy. I'm very glad family are here today because I was very fond of Paddy over many, many years. But it goes to show how these things can change. I'm giving little insights into this because that's what I can do. I think that Brian Faulkner was invited to Leeds University to speak there. He was very prominent. His invitations were coming in from right across the world, but throughout the UK. And it was a very nice invitation. He decided to accept it. And we were due to fly out in a commercial flight. And unfortunately, the day before, his father died. So we couldn't go. And that day it was cancelled, and they had done a lot of work, and the police had laid on a lot because he was still the man with his name in internment files and internment warrants, and he was definitely a target, and the English police were very worried about that. So a couple of weeks later it was reinstated, all to go again, and on the morning we were to go on a commercial flight, word came to the private office there'd been a plot discovered amongst IRA papers that Belfast was going to be taken over in parts and held. Some of you may remember the story. Held in a sort of military campaign, and great concern. Brian Faulkner was called down to the Secretary of State's office. It held everything up, but the Secretary of State said, I still want you to go to Leeds, so I'll give you a helicopter and an RAF plane to fly you there. So that's what happened. We went to Leeds. We arrived we were escorted, we were told, by 600 police who had sealed the whole city off. It was quite extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. We arrived in the university, we went to the hall to speak, and the noise below was terrible. Steel Eye Span, the folk rock group, were playing in the hall below, and all you could hear was the wonderful music from Steel Eye Span coming through the floor. I had a quiet word with someone and it was stopped. 3 minutes later, the talk started. 2 minutes later, a police officer came up to me and said, "There's a bomb scare, we'll have to evacuate." And that was it. So all that work, but it showed the pressure that ministers were talking about, and this idea of personal protection weapons and so on was not so fanciful, because there were definitely people out there wanting it.
Can I ask you just to
You can.
there?
Yes, I had actually got to it. When it fell shortly afterwards.
All right, okay. Geoff, both Chris and Hugh mentioned the EU Of course, UK joined the EU in 1973, but it took a while for offices and stuff to get set up. So there was an EU dimension to the Sunningdale Agreement. How important was that?
Well, the relevance of Sunningdale, I think, not only to the EU but also in Northern Ireland, was that before, in the history of Northern Ireland, which was relatively introspective, it opened the agenda completely. And it allowed a breath of fresh air to blow in from outside. In order for that to happen, however, the question was who would effectively control the internal Northern Ireland European agenda. And the answer to that is that it was the three MEPs, John Hume, Ian Paisley, and John Taylor, who effectively did that. And in the doing of that, they decided to distance the Northern Ireland Civil Service from any real position of selecting who would become the first head of a European Commission office here. And after discussions in Brussels involving the two British commissioners and the Irish commissioner, it was eventually decided that amongst a fairly heavy field, an individual who was not currently living in Northern Ireland but had a number of external experiences would be appointed to that post. And I had the privilege of that honour in 1970, whatever year it was. Therefore, the first thing that I think is important is that it was the MEPs who advanced the case of the European Union in Northern Ireland. Secondly, of course, it was the Irish government and the British government who together accommodated the Northern Ireland scene within the European Union. They also played their part in opening the agenda, because from the time of the accession of Northern Ireland to the European Union in 1973, the North-South relationship became much more open than it already had been. And when our office in the European Commission was established there, of course we had Brussels colleagues, one of whom is two of whom are here today, I think, in Dublin, and that enabled all kinds of unprecedented relationships to take place between Belfast and Dublin, between the North and the South. In a sense, when European commissioners came to the Republic, my colleague in Dublin used to invite me down to Dublin. And when European commissioners came to Northern Ireland, I would invite him up to Northern Ireland too. And in that way, a huge arrangement of interconnecting linkages became the order of the day. Meantime, of course, the European Union itself was changing. It was concentrating not just on Northern Ireland, where, in their mind's eye, the peace process was the key factor, but also on the enlargement of the European Union away from the dictatorships of Spain and Portugal and Greece into a democratic union, and a democratic union in which sovereignty was shared rather than sovereignty being exercised by individual members of the European Union. So our relationships with the South became closer and closer, in particular with the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, as has been alluded to in previous speakers. In addition to which, those years from 73 until 79 and later were ones in which, within the United Kingdom, there were problems, because the accession of Britain to the European Union in 73 brought forth a huge difficulty within the British political establishment, to such an extent that a referendum was called in 1973, which was won fairly convincingly, but it did raise the spectre of sovereignty as distinct from shared sovereignty within the European Union, and that, of course, didn't ever go away in the context of the British government. I remember as well the 10th anniversary of the European Union in Northern Ireland, where the major contributors were in a big dinner in Belfast, to which were invited all the district council heads and many others from Britain and Europe and the South. The major speakers were Edward Heath and Garrett Fitzgerald. And the significance of that occasion was that as Garrett Fitzgerald was the first speaker, before he opened his mouth to say a single word, he was given a standing ovation, thus marking, in my view, the potential which Europe had in the future of Northern Ireland. In stark contrast, however, the next morning, Ian Paisley gave me a phone call and he said, "Geoff, don't answer any calls from the Northern Irish press this evening. I'm going to make a speech in Banbridge," which he did. And on that occasion, Paisley fired 4 of the 5 DUP mayors who had attended the dinner the evening before for whining and dining with pro-Europeans. Just to give you some sense of the feelings in the grassroots of the country at that time. As the years progressed and Europe became a more comfortable presence in the public domain, we were able to discuss matters not only with all of the political parties, but also with the paramilitary organizations and with the provisional IRA. Interesting that at that time, under direct rule, the provisional IRA people had not been able to, were prevented from broadcasting on television or radio anywhere in the United Kingdom, but they came to the office in order to discuss housing in West Belfast. And to the same extent, the paramilitary organizations, in a semi-secret way, had us to discussions up in the Shankill Road to see what on earth the European Union could do for the grassroots of the working class people in those areas. So I look back in my time in Northern Ireland with a great deal of interest, because I think in many respects it opened up, as I said at the beginning, a large number of avenues of access to the wider world which never before had been opened up again. Now, of course, we have left the European Union. That is, the United Kingdom has left the European Union.
And that's a whole other story, Geoff, which...
I'm just finishing this, but Northern Ireland is different. And there is an essential difference between Northern Ireland's context in Western Europe and in the United Kingdom's context, the European Union, as we move into the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Geoff. Much appreciated. Before I come back to Hugh to talk about Merlin Rees, I want to bring Eileen in because, as Geoff mentioned, the community on the Shankill Road. And Eileen was, what, 18? When? 17, 18, so 1973. Did working class loyalist areas feel that Sunningdale or the looming agreement or the talks were really hopeful or going to bring about peace?
No, I don't think so. I was scared when they were showing them clips that I would be on the screen at those protests, because I think I went up every hill and down every hill with Ian Paisley at the time. And it was and I'm speaking from a personal point of view, but, you know, living on the Shankill, grew up on the Shankill, you know, there was a lot of fear factor put into people, you know, of going against the Sunningdale Agreement. You know, it was only in later years that I found out what the Sunningdale Agreement was actually about, because what we were told was it was home rule. It was, you know, they were going to try and take over and we're not going to be British anymore. And it was all that propaganda that actually was there throughout the whole conflict, right up to the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that's one of the turning points for me when I started getting educated through the trade union movement that, you know, we weren't told, because there was a thing, and there still is a thing, that you do what your unionist politicians told you to do. You know, you just vote for this, you know, just vote for that, that this is, we're going to look after you. And, you know, they can see how well they looked after us, can't you? Like, you know, 50 years on, we're still struggling. We're still the highest rate of poverty, working class people. It was all the working class people that suffered the most throughout those. And even during the Loyalist strike, you know, I get where you come from, and I've actually spoke to Anne about this, that Paddy Devlin was a hero because he found a wee fund in Belfast City Council, and everybody that was on strike had go to the brew and got a week's pay, and it was down to Paddy Devlin. And the other memory that I have was everybody walking about with a bit of sponge on their coat, because Wilson said that we're a pack of spongers. So everybody then started wearing a bit of sponge on their lapel just to show that they were one of the spongers that Harold Wilson had actually said. So my experience isn't round the table, and I often wonder if women had been involved in the Sunningdale Agreement, would it have went through? I think maybe we would have. It made a different aspect to it, but I think that our politicians and government has learned that when there's women round the table, then we get solutions.
You've seen in the... Yep. You've seen in the footage at the start, you know, lots and lots of unionist women out marching on the streets and singing. And this week, last week and this week, there's been footage on the TV about the Ulster Workers' Council strike and the lack of food, the lack of, you know, everything really. And women, I remember a comment of one woman said, "Sure, we'll eat grass." What's your reflections of the community at that time? You said you marched up hills and down dales. And Chris mentioned the big gathering in the Ormeau Park. Were you there?
I was.
You were?
I was. I was in the Ormeau Park, and I was in Newton Ards, and I was at Stormount.
Yep.
You know, because that's everybody was doing that at that time. You know, and again, it was the fear factor. You know, I mean, everybody was told to go. You didn't know where you were going and what you were going to do, but you were just told to get out on the streets and do it. And, you know, that probably was the time of my life, you know, that I joined the UDA to become a nurse, because we were being told there was going to be a war coming, and the troubles that we were having were going to get worse. But, and it wasn't illegal at that time in the UDA. I never was trained to be a nurse. I was trained to deliver milk, bread and butter and sugar to the pensioners, all down in behind the no-go areas, because most of the streets on the Shankill were all barricaded off to stop the route from the falls to Ardoyne at the time, to the Bone, you know, because Shankill was actually in the middle of two Catholic areas as such at that time. But, you know, as years go on, you get to know the people within the Falls and people within Ardoyne and people within nationalist areas were suffering exactly the same as what we were suffering. There was always a lot of propaganda going about, you know, they're coming to get us, they're coming to get us. And it was a fear factor. It was not an Nelsonian fear factor. And then I actually got my education through the trade union movement. And I decided way back then, 76, 77, that I was going to be on the other side of it. That then I got started to be called a Lundy because I wasn't going with the crowd. I became more of a socialist and more about people rather than religion, to take the religion out of it. I actually campaigned through the trade union movement to stop the strip searching in Armagh's prison. Within my community at that time, that was seen as a Republican issue because it was IRA women that were being strip searched. And the trade union taught me that it was a human rights issue and it didn't matter who it was they were searching. Strip searching was against the human rights of any individual, and that doesn't matter who they are. And that has been my journey right up until today.
Thanks, Eileen. Hugh.
Just picking up on Eileen, Eileen, I remember that the representative for the Shankill at that time was Johnny McQuaid, and Johnny was one of the most authentic of Paisley's supporters at the time. And probably one of the mistakes that Brian Faulkner made was to appoint John Baxter, who was a solicitor from Ballymoney, I think, as information minister. And McQuaid was brilliant for his in one-liners. He said to Faulkner, he said, "You've appointed a solicitor, John Baxter, as your information minister." He's a solicitor. He said, if I was up in court and he was my solicitor, I'd plead guilty. Was his put down line of Baxter. Just before we come to back to Marilyn Reid, both Chris and Geoff were mentioning Europe there, and Paul was mentioning earlier that the one thing that the Good Friday Agreement had that Sunningdale didn't have was that wider international support, and I can very much associate with that, because I was back many years later working with Malin and Trimble from Brussels, and we were meeting Chirac in the Elysee Palace. And at the end of the meeting, Chirac told that the two guys that they had a vrai ami, a true friend in Clinton, and they didn't seem really to appreciate that. He said, President Clinton never allowed a conversation he was having with them, whether it was about Russia, the Middle East, China, some things never changed. He said, no matter what the affairs of the world were, he said, Clinton never allowed a meeting to finish without him urging for a positive pressure to be put on the British and on the EU. So it wasn't just up front Clinton was, so it was that international, and I think that had a big effect that we didn't have. Coming back to recalling and the collapse of it, that said, overwhelming support. We must remember that the first 2 days of the strike, 80% of workers went to work. And the Ulster Workers' Council panicked. It was they who got the UDA and the UVF out to start to intimidate, block roads. And Paisley, who we see here goldering from the steps of Stormont, or from the balcony of Stormont, Paisley had got offside. Paisley went to America and Canada for the first 7 days. And it was only when he came back and saw that the strike was actually working that he began to move in. And in I think it's Ed Maloney's book, there's a wonderful standoff when Paisley walks into the headquarters of the UWC, and he's sitting on Glen Barr's seat, and Blair and Barr requires Paisley to move. But because West and Harry West and the rest of them were a lot weaker, and Paisley shouted the loudest, Paisley got to the front at the end of it. So let me come to what Noel and Sean were talking about.
But he actually got out of the chair, but he lifted the chair and took the chair with him.
That's probably true, yeah. The ultimate judgment has to be that, well, put it the other way around. When governments follow on from another government, when a new administration takes over, they tend to adopt the policies. Charlie Haughey had railed against the Anglo-Irish Agreement, but when he came into power, he was ready to operate it. Wilson and his administration never bought in, never took ownership of Sunningdale. It was a Ted Heath arrangement, it was a Ted Heath agreement, it was a Tory thing, and they had just fought a bitter election with the trade unions. And Wilson was totally cynical about it. Whatever works will let us through. Gareth Fitzgerald, in his book, says that Shirley Williams had told him later that that Whitehall, that and the Department of Defence were reluctant to go in. They didn't want a war, they said, on both sides. So the prevarication and the equivocation by Rees, if he had moved in those first 2 days, or the third day, or even on the fourth day, I think people would have stayed with the Sunningdale arrangements, and then the possibility of all that Noel and Sean were talking about, of winding back the implementation of the Council of Ireland might have been possible. Faulkner himself, writing in his own book, said that the outcry about the Council of Ireland was a red herring. It was really power sharing at the end of the day that was the issue. But it was clear that, I mean, we all now know, and I think it's in Noel's book, that Wilson had previously gone behind the backs of the Irish government and talked to the IRA and talked to IRA representatives. Even the NIO at the time of Sunningdale had a link out to Jimmy Drum, and were talking quietly to the IRA. So there was no commitment on that Labour government to sustaining the Stormont arrangements, and that's to a great extent why it fell, because the army weren't moved until too late. And consequently, the opportunity that Brian Faulkner thought we might move into 2 years of normality never got the chance to arise.
You can see the similarities, or I hear it. I mean, I was 7 at the time of the Sunningdale Agreement, so I don't remember too much about it, apart from getting a bottle of milk out of a milk churn in a big long queue. So I don't remember a lot at the time. But you can see the threads, if you like, of Sunningdale through, as someone said earlier, the Anglo-Irish Agreement and right up to the Good Friday Agreement. You can also see the similarities with Ian Paisley in many respects, who was then, when he seen the strike as being successful, jumping on that bandwagon, becoming the lead spokesperson, if you like, and wanting the downfall or the collapse of the Sunningdale Agreement. Because I remember quite distinctly, you know, when he and other colleagues walked out of the Good Friday Agreement negotiations, multi-party talks, and then, without having read what was in the agreement, immediately came out against it and campaigned actively within the community against it, and was just thinking about what Eileen said, you know, this fear factor that was running through politics at the time, that he was like a lightning rod for this fear. And I mean, he'd been on the rise from the sort of late 50s into the early 60s. You must have witnessed that, and that rage, if you like, coming through all of the time. And would it have benefited it had that been stopped, or had he been brought in from the cold at that time?
I don't think he wanted to come in from the cold at the time, and he always stayed out until he saw what was happening. I think the failure probably, and it happened again with Trimble to an extent, by any assessment, unionism did remarkably well in the Good Friday Agreement. They got an awful lot of recognition in it. Again, in Sunningdale, Northern Ireland has been recognised as an entity for the first time. Whatever about the Council of Ireland, it had a unanimity rule about it. Nothing could be decided unless the unionists agreed to it. But they failed to go out and sell it at any point. And they allowed Paisley to get the upper hand in denouncing it, and then never, never, never. And thankfully, the Anglo-Irish Agreement didn't have the Northern Ireland administration. It was a British-Irish thing, and they were kept. Sean and his colleagues were in contact, and Noel were in contact with their counterparts in London and the agreement, because had they been involved, I think they might not have happened. And the resolve of Thatcher, once having gone with it, to see it through, and remember after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the Ulster Workers' Council, the same people, tried to create another strike, bring people, but the resolve was there this time to see it through, and it got through. One other thing I probably should say, because I think I'm the only one from the SDLP here, it's assumed that it was easy for the SDLP. The Sunningdale agreement by the Republican and by their fellow travellers was denounced. Neil Blaney called it a day of shame, the agreement. It was a day of shame for we were Quislings. Frank McManus said that we had recognised and handed total authority over Northern Ireland. Bernadette and the Republican movement said it was a disgrace. And so the SDLP were getting it in the neck pretty heavily because of agreeing to go into it. But they came out and, with Hume's leadership, were able to sell it. And in that Westminster election that was caused the downfall, the SDLP, even though they were running in seats that were unwinnable and were an inbuilt unionist majority, they still managed to put their vote up from what they thought was an impossibly high in the 73 election, where they swept the decks, by another 20,000. Sean Hollywood got over 25,000 in South Down, and I was fighting Londonderry, as it was called then, East Londonderry, as it is now, with Coleraine and Imavadi, again unwinnable. And still there were almost 24,000 people coming out to support us. So the SDLP saw off a very vicious anti-Sunningdale intimidatory campaign by the provosts and their fellow travellers at the time. And I don't think they would have managed to do that had there not been some commitment in principle to a Council of Ireland.
Thanks. Yes, go ahead, Chris.
Could I just, I'm conscious I've already spoken a lot, but we're sitting here, for me, 50 years almost to the hour, when I stood with my two colleagues between Brian Faulkner on one side and Jerry Fitt on the other, on the first floor of Parliament buildings, looking out at tens of thousands of unionists coming up the drive to collapse, ultimately, the whole event, based on Sunningdale, based on everything that had been agreed. The police radio was saying we can't see the tail of the procession in Carryduff, and coming from Newton Ards and saying we can't see the tail of it there, marched up and heads were hung, and that was it. 33 years later, one of the happiest moments of my life was standing in the same building, a floor below, watching Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness taking power within a scheme, and this is in my own personal view of Sunningdale for slow learners, but you had it. So that building brought, for very different reasons, but maybe the same reason, the horrible nature of things and the wonderful nature of things. So it's, I'd like for my own comments to end on a positive note, and certainly that was a positive note, and while we've had trouble since then, up and down, it's set there.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to open it up to the floor now for questions. If you could just keep your comments or your questions very brief and introduce yourself, please.
I just want to thank the whole panel for their time. My name is Marion Kane, and I'm from a voluntary community worker from Ardoyne. I work closely with Eileen Weir as well. Just wanted to highlight all the stuff I've heard today has been all high above me, all government decisions, whatever, that were imposed on me and my community over the years. In 1971, I was put out of my home, and I lost my home and whatever. So I wasn't the only one. And because I'm a Catholic and would look towards the south, so down south, because I consider myself Irish, I felt that I was being wanted to be annihilated by the Protestant community because they were being told that we were the enemy. And, community were against each other because we were afraid. I mean, what happened in Ardoyne happened in Shankill, but, we just feared for our lives. And when the army came in first, the army was put into Catholic areas because, you know, the Protestant are supposed to support the army. So, you know, the whole campaign, the whole thing about the Troubles, we never supported it, never supported the IRA violence or whatever, but the people on the ground actually suffered, just suffered really, really terribly from the so-called political spectrum and the government spectrum imposed on us what they thought was good for us or bad for us and their ideas and whatever. And actually hundreds and thousands of people lost their lives. And I know the last speaker spoke about bulletproof windows being put on their homes or whatever. Nobody put bulletproof windows in our homes. A lot of people in my area were shot dead sitting in their living room or walking along the road going to work. So, you know, that whole thing doesn't joy with me. So it's just to say that we suffered 100% more, and so did the Shankill community, than any politician or any political thing, and they're actually playing with people's lives at that time. It's sad to say, and it's just changing for the better, thank God, but we still aren't there yet.
Yeah, thanks, Marion. You make some very good points there, and I think the whole point of Sunningdale and the principles and the people involved at that time was actually to try and stop the violence, and unfortunately it didn't stop. As we know, it continued for a long time. I'm going to ask for Mary Madden, and then for Anne Devlin.
Could I go back to your Mary Madden, ex-NIO official of some years now? Can I go back to your comment, Hugh, whenever you mentioned that Harold Wilson, when he came into government, didn't endorse or support the Sunningdale Agreement? Could you give me some insight as to why you think that? I'm very conscious that in 1998, when I was working in the Northern Ireland office at that time and going through the whole thing till we got there, one of the things that actually made sure that we got the agreement was that we had two premiers, you know, with Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern in power for 10 years and could keep the continuity. But when we got to the end and when Labour went out of power under Gordon Brown, of course, by that stage, and we got a Tory Lib Dem pact, we had now achieved the Good Friday Agreement. We'd also achieved all of the devolution of all of the powers, because the last bit was the policing and criminal justice, which we got across the line in 2010. And therefore, when the Tory Lib Dems came in, it was a question of the thing was done and to get on with trying to implement and get things and make it better for the community. So what went wrong in 73, I think, to come back to my original question, that Harold Wilson didn't see the benefit and endorse the agreement and take ownership of it.
Well, that's basically, Mary, what it was, I think, is my analysis as well, that he didn't take ownership of it. You heard Sean, particularly, and Noel say the importance of the dynamic between prime ministers, and that Fitzgerald and Heath, and even Jack Lynch and Heath had got on, and that Brian Faulkner and Liam Cosgrove had gone on. And the dynamic also has to be sure. I'm quite sure that the Good Friday Agreement, I mean, we waited through quite John Major having difficulties, everybody having difficulty. We waited until Blair and Ahern were there to gel, and the two of them could drive it and could see what was there. And that chemistry and dynamic, I think, was very important. I think also, Mary, we have to bear in mind that that was a minority government that had got elected in 74. Wilson had 301 seats. Heath had 297. They had 4 seats. Wilson was ahead. The Liberals didn't. Wilson had gone, or Heath had gone, saying, "Who governs Britain?" And it wasn't quite clear what the British people said, except that they said to him, "We don't want you governing it, you know, any longer because of the strike." But there were 11 unionists, and they were disillusioned with Heath because Heath had cancelled Stormont in 72. He was keeping those in mind as well, but he had no real commitment to it. He had earlier talked of bringing the troops out altogether and saying, let them cut their own throats. Let them fight to cut each other's throats. So Wilson had a diffidence about it. But feed that into what the military were saying, that they didn't want to be fighting on both sides. They were already fighting IRA. They didn't want to take on the loyalists. You then get another bit, and then you get the weak-minded equivocation, basically, of Rees, and you had the real dilemma. And so the thing fell apart because the strikers on day one, day two, expected, as happened later on, that they would be confronted. When they weren't, they got bolder and bolder.
Thank you. I just want, it's linked to Mary's, the last point. It's absolutely triggered by what Eileen Weir had said about the Labour Party, about the trade unions, and the whole idea of not understanding, of being fed particular propaganda. The point is, I come of a background of NILP. And my father was elected NILP, moved to set up as one of the founders of the SDLP, and was in the position in Stormont during the strike. And I was rather glad to see from this discussion that you weren't displacing the importance of the loyalist strike, that it doesn't become, oh, it would have happened, fallen anyway. And I understand Paul's point about them. This opened the door to during the time of a Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, who was not particularly committed to what who had no affection at all for the loyalist community. But what is really puzzling, of course, for me, and still remains a puzzle, is the question of how a split Labour movement, how the NILP was largely Protestant Labour. I mean, it was, and when Paddy moves and takes his party, goes and joins the SDLP, its Labour roots are quite shallow. In fact, they're almost non-existent, to be honest. So what I've got almost a mirror thing to what Eileen is saying, that the trade unions helped her, gave her political form and so on, but the problem becomes that we found in terms of what happened that Edward Heath was more sympathetic a figure to the power sharing initiative than Wilson was, and I would normally have been delighted to get a Labour government in. The worry is always, and even at a time when there were negotiations going on, I mean, the NILP, members of the NILP were part of the loyalist strike. They were an important part. They were leaders. And Brian Garrett, who's one of the leaders of one of the people in the NILP, was asked by Harry Murray, who was a member of the NILP and regarded as a leader of the strike, to negotiate with the Ulster Workers' Loyalist Council to come to an agreement to get the strike called off, and he was prevented from doing so. And he was prevented from doing so by the civil servants, the Northern Ireland Office civil servants, and that's something I was told. But the crucial thing, the real loss, in the sense that the tragedy of it all, linked to all that what follows. The tragedy is, why does it take everybody so long? Why does the Labour movement eventually becomes ineffective? From that moment on, it loses its position, certainly within the Catholic community, and and then there's a kind of distrust of Protestant workers, a terrible distrust that at the time I never had before because I was in the Labour Party. So and there's a fundamental flaw in the fact that there are two parts of Ireland with two different Labour movements that don't talk to each other and are being regarded by Westminster as not as not important, and that remains the fact that today the Labour movement in England do not have any links, don't consider the links with Northern Ireland Labour, don't consider the links with Southern Irish Labour. I mean, it's a very important issue, and I do think it shouldn't be underestimated what happened to us, because wonderful as the Good Friday Agreement is, we still don't have any representative of Labour politics in this country. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say.
Very true, yeah. Noel.
Sorry to intervene again, but a very brief comment on Harold Wilson. I think there's reason to believe that his powers were failing in the end. He retired, I think, around 1975 and took people by surprise. I just add that when I was ambassador in London, I was told by a very senior official who had been very close to him, who drove him to a dinner in Oxford after his retirement and told me in confidence at the time that he was beginning to become senile, that he wasn't the full person that he had been. Now, I don't know if that extends back as far as 1974, but it seems to me to may excuse possibly some of his actions and things at that time. It's just a possibility I raise. I don't know for certain that he was senile, but certainly he was beginning to show signs at the end, I was told.
Thanks, Noel.
By end of 74, he goes back to the electorate and he gets an overwhelming majority. So he leads them. So I mean, I accept, Noel, that what you say, and certainly he became senile afterwards. I didn't realise that it had set in that early. And for the British electorate, I mean, they've elected fools in the past, and they've elected Fool as Prime Minister the last time around. But I had never known them to elect anybody senile who led a party, you know. So. Yeah.
Thanks, Eileen.
Yeah, you know. Looking back and where I am today and where I was then, you know, I mean, I have learned an awful lot of lessons going forward in the life that I do now, peace builder and good relations, and we still have a lot to do there because it's trying to be stirred up again with the constitutional question, and it's very much being jumped on now as another political row coming for the future, which we're heavily involved in it right across all the communities. All the grassroots organisations are having the conversation. It's not about when or where or how, it's having that conversation. And we need to actually learn lessons from the past and keep people the heart and soul of this country, which is the grassroots. The people at grassroots level need to be kept informed. And that was one of the reasons I was one of the foot soldiers coming up to the vote of the Good Friday Agreement, that we needed to make sure that the information got out. We got easy read documents, we had classes, we had dialogues, we had everything that we could get to give the people the truth. Not to tell them how to vote. We wanted to give them the truth so they could make up their own mind whether they wanted the Good Friday Agreement or not. And I think that's a lesson that I learned from all the other agreements that we didn't get an opportunity to vote for. And that goes right back. The Sunningdale, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, you know, the Stormont House Agreement, all these agreements that have came about over the last 50 years, we only got the vote on one of them. We only got the vote on one of them. And we have to remember that the people who are working the hardest and the people who are getting paid the least are the ones that's keeping this country going. And if it wasn't for Mo Malone, I need to mention her name, we probably wouldn't have got the Good Friday Agreement over the line either by the paramilitaries, because she went in and took the risk and went into the blocks and spoke to the paramilitaries face to face.
I think that I don't see any more questions, so I think I'll just ask each of you really just final thoughts in 2 minutes. Geoff, let's start with you. Final thoughts, just.
My final thoughts are very simple. They are based on the fact that it's important for all of the people in Northern Ireland to think ahead rather than think back, and for all of the people in Northern Ireland to think on a wider plane than they have tended to do in the past. I couple that with the notion, as I half said earlier on, that of course there is the United Kingdom, constitutionally a sovereign state, but within the United Kingdom there is a place called Northern Ireland, which as a result of the Brexit arrangement has had given to it a unique arrangement trade-wise in the context of the single market with the European Union, and I think that that should be cherished.
Thanks, Geoff. Chris?
I think, as I've been alluding to whenever I was talking, and all the conversations this afternoon convinced me on that I'm right, that this is a process. We're in a, I would say, 100-year plus process, not in front of us, but it's been going for that stage. You can draw a line here or there. We're still moving. The crucial thing is that we need to do it in a peaceful way. Not one person must be injured or killed in how we do it. I'm optimistic that that is now a distinct possibility with careful handling, but it's moving. So anyone that thinks we're in the final state of anything is false, but that's not a bad thing. And the more people can come to see it that way, I think the better for us all.
Thanks, Hugh.
Thanks, Tom. Eileen was mentioning the different agreements that there have been, all of them. Windsor is the latest one we have. And I think at the time you felt let down and a sense of frustration, but it was, you weren't going back to second-class citizenship. You were a bit like Samuel Beckett, no matter, fail again, try again, fail again, and you just kept going for that. But I think it was Duncan earlier said, you know, the emblems that were there, elements that were there in 73 were self-evident, and they've had to remain there throughout. Equality and power sharing, respect for human rights, a solution that is beyond the boundaries of Northern Ireland, that brings in London and Dublin, and together with the European community support, and the peace package was a big difference to that, and the American support, we've been able to move forward steadily, and all we can do is keep moving forward.
I want to move forward, but I want to see the poor get rich and the richer not get any richer than what they are now, because there's a big, well, can I tell you that there is a big gap, and the gap's getting bigger between the poor and the rich. And, you know, we have an opportunity with the single market, but we need to make sure that those jobs that come are paid proper, the proper jobs, proper education, proper training, that the poor are no longer poor, and we can actually start climbing up that ladder.
I think, as a friend of mine once said, and this can apply to the class struggle, or it can apply to our conflict, or it can apply to anything, is that you're going nowhere without me, and I'm going nowhere without you. Just if you'd give our panel, please, a round of applause. So I have the honour of introducing our next guest, Bríd Rodgers. Bríd, I met at the negotiations, where our party leader at the time, the Progressive Unionist party leader at the time, Hugh Smith, used to call her a bridge too far for his sins. He was some disruptor. But Bríd has been a civil rights campaigner. She was a senior negotiator with the SDLP during the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, we all remember her during the the foot and mouth disease when she was Agriculture Minister in our Assembly and Minister in our Executive. So, Bríd, you're very welcome, and thanks so
Dawn.
much.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for that very complimentary introduction. Can I first of all say that I've been called worse than a bridge too far. I used to be called during the Gavahi Road riots the Witch of Drumcree, and they used to have pictures of me up on a broomstick. So I've had worse names called. Anyway, I just want to say that was a very, very enlightening afternoon, and it was great to hear the contributions of the people who are so much involved from the very beginning, leading up to Sunningdale, and afterwards. It really was a joy to listen to them, and to how committed all of those people were to resolving the problem. I think, first of all, I just want to say we have learned a lot of lessons from all the years before and since Sunningdale. We learned the first lesson when the civil rights movement, by peaceful protest over 3 years, achieved reforms that had been denied for the 50 years before that, or whatever it was. So, you know, we had intermittent violence over decades in Northern Ireland. We had discrimination, we had divided communities, we had a kind of an uneasy sort of a peace where people sort of got on together in their own communities. But, you know, there was no relationship between a lot of them, however, except in golf clubs, of course. However, the first change in Northern Ireland happened as a result of a peaceful protest, and that was the first lesson. And then the next thing that happened, of course, we had a few horrendous years after '69. The Sunningdale Agreement was the first real experiment in trying to bring peace by recognising the rights of both the Unionists and the Nationalists in Union, which something that John Hume had preached since 1965 in an Irish Times article, I believe. So Sunningdale was a breakthrough, and we were so delighted. But unfortunately, in spite of being so euphoric at the time, as a lot of us were, the thing fell apart. And we have to ask ourselves, why did it fall apart? Now, the first thing I want to say is that it was never going to be easy. And we have seen the Good Friday Agreement. Delivering it is not easy either, and has not been easy. And I suppose you could say it hasn't completely been successful yet, but at least we're on the way. But the Good Friday, the Sunningdale Agreement was brought down mainly, I was interested to hear Eileen talk about fear. It was brought down mainly by the fear of the Unionist community that they were being sold out. And that fear was conveyed to them by their leaders. It shows you the importance of leadership, of courageous leadership. It was conveyed to them by their leaders, who over the years had told them that they were going to be sold out because of the IRA, sporadic IRA violence, and some of the Republican rhetoric. And that fear was conveyed to them over years, and of course was magnified after Sunningdale. We all remember, no surrender, not an inch, you're going to be taken over, you have to come out and fight. And Eileen Weir described it so well about the fear in the community and why she got out and did what she did to try and bring down Sunningdale. And then Sinn Féin rejected it because they said it didn't accept Irish sovereignty. And they used to call us the stoop down low party because we had actually stooped down to accept unionism's rights to be British and to allow the British government as well as the Irish government to be involved in such talks, because their view was the only majority that counts in Ireland is the majority of the whole people of Ireland. And they were fighting a war to get the Brits out and to bring about a united Ireland, and therefore they rejected Sunningdale because it didn't deliver 100%. And I think, if anything, it was a demonstration of the futility of violence in getting us anywhere, getting peace, and the fact that it was followed by the worst, the bloodiest decades of the Troubles in the 70s and the 80s, which saw so many families being destroyed, so many lives lost, you know, destruction everywhere, bombing. I mean, it was, you got up you turned on the radio in the morning with fear, because you knew you were going to hear there was either a pub bombing, there was somebody found dead with masks on them in a ditch, or a family had been shot out. I'll just give you an example. Most of the people here, a lot of them have been through a lot of it, but for people who have not been through those years and who seem to have a kind of a glorified idea of, you know, what the IRA did, what they achieved and all of this, the reality of it was, I'm just going to paint a picture of one thing, two families, the O'Dowds in County Armagh, two young boys and their uncle shot in their own homes at a party just after Christmas. The two boys were home from England, and their uncle was shot, and their father was very badly wounded. He actually died only, would you believe it, Barney O'Dowd, he only died about, I think, 2 months ago at the age of 100. But on the same night, the Reevy family, 3 young boys sitting at home, probably watching television, shot in their own homes by the UVF. And the very following day, what happened? The IRA lined up 9 workmen coming home from their work, looking forward to getting into their family homes, shot them all just relentlessly, took them out of a bus and just riddled them. Only one survived. And that's just one small incident of many, many others that happened because of the fact that Sunningdale was rejected by people who wanted all or nothing, people who just could not understand what John Hume was preaching was in a divided society, conflicting aspirations. You can only get peace by accepting the rights of both. So that was why Sunningdale failed. I'm not going to go on about it because I know it was rejected by both the Sinn Féin and by the unionist community as a whole. But one of the other things, I think that, apart from the Loyalist strike, which completely ended it, why did the Loyalist strike get such traction? And it has been mentioned here because, first of all, the British government failed to stand up to it in the early days when it didn't really have support. And a lot of people were afraid to go to work because they were intimidated. But the other thing was that the 1974 election, which was called a landslide against the agreement, wasn't really a landslide against the agreement. It was pictured as that, and therefore that the whole unionist community was up in arms against it. The reality was that, as Hugh pointed out, there were a lot of people, probably if you added up all the other votes, the pro-Faulkner votes and the pro-SDLP votes and others, you probably didn't have as many people. It may not have been a landslide at all. I don't believe it was. It was the effect of the first past the post system, which allows a small minority, actually not even a 50% minority, to win a seat in an area where they normally wouldn't have won it if you had proportional representation. So I think the lesson of that was that a number of factors brought Sunningdale down, and one of them was that which gave sort of strength to the idea that the whole unionist community was rejecting it. And it's interesting to hear, in particular, Eileen Weir talking about the fear factor and how she was terrified and she did what she was told and she went out and she demonstrated and all of that. Again, that's a failure of leadership. It's a failure of the system where people are led to believe for years that the only answer to defending their own status quo, their position, or else changing it is either violence against the other community. And I think the lesson of Sunningdale, which eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement, is that dialogue, and I must mention also, Noel Dorr mentioned at the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement, that was another watershed. because until that, it was very difficult to get unionists to engage. And I remember Molyneux in particular sitting on his hands and just refusing to engage. And if you can't get the other community to engage, what are you going to do? But the Anglo-Irish Agreement was the first time that the two governments got together, and I have to say, diplomacy played a huge part in it, because if you all, some of you will remember the out speech of Maggie Thatcher, the Prime Minister, when she rubbished all the proposals that were made by the New Ireland Forum, and that had the whole of Ireland up in arms against it. I was in the Senate at the time. Everybody, I remember a guy in Logue who would have been not even SDLP, not Republican, saying to me, "We're all Republicans now," because people were so angry about that. And the fact of the matter, I was in the Senate and I asked Garrett, could I see him? And I said, "Garrett, you have to do something. You have to say something. The whole of Ireland is up in arms and you're not saying anything." He said, "Bríd, I can start a row across the Irish Sea. I can start a shouting match across the Irish Sea. Where's that going to get us? Going to get us nowhere. We've been doing it for years." But the diplomats in the Foreign Affairs, and I know that two of them are here, Noel and Sean, and the diplomats on the British side spent a year working on trying to undo the damage and trying to get back some equilibrium to move forward. And the 85 agreement did that because for the first time, John Hume's dictum, he always said, was the problem with the veto is that the unionists have a veto on constitutional change, but they're using it as a veto on reform. And that was the truth, because any time there was any talk of reform, the unionists were up in arms. Oh no, we can't have that, because they had a veto on constitutional change. That changed with the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and that was a catalyst. And eventually, I'm trying to think about what other, Eileen. I think, I must say that Paul Bew, whom I have great respect for because I got to know him better during my time as minister in the first assembly when he worked with Tim Trimble, and I found him very helpful and very good. But I just disagree with the idea that the unionist rejection was as total, or would have been as total as it was had it not been for the rhetoric and the fear that was put into them that this indeed was the road to a united Ireland. And what used to say, Sunningdale is only, Dublin is only a Sunningdale away. That was the message. So I think that the clear message, listening to everyone that contributed today, and I was particularly impressed by Eileen Weir because of how she described the feeling, what people begin to feel if they're misled, if they're told a story that is not actually true, but perhaps in the interest of keeping their own political positions safe. That was interesting. And I know you had the same thing on the other side of people being told that, the only way to get Irish unity is through violence, and we'll have to get the British out and all that. And that creates a sort of a sneaking, not support, but a sneaking support. Even the time of, I remember when the Troubles, it was very early, it was in the 50s, that's how old I am. I was living in Donegal, and I remembered the story about Sean O'Hanlon and the songs about O'Hanlon and attacking the British garrison and all that. And there was that kind of a feeling within the nationalists that we'll never change anything. I know the civil rights movement changed that, but that was the feeling. So leadership is important. Non-violence is counterproductive. It's futile. It brings suffering to all communities, unionists and nationalists alike suffered. The only way forward, as had been demonstrated by Sunningdale and followed on through the Good Friday Agreement, in spite of all the horrendous violence and atrocities that happened, the only thing that will bring peace in the end is the tough work of politics, dialogue and diplomacy. And I think if that lesson has been learned, then good. And I do believe, to end on a maybe a happier note, I do believe it has been learned, because I think there have been a lot of difficulties in the last 15 years, particularly in Northern Ireland. But I still think that people now, they realise that, you know, you can't get 100% of everything, and you just have to negotiate. So I'm looking forward to seeing Northern Ireland and the Republic moving closer together, working closer together, and eventually evolving to what I would have aspired for, a united Ireland, but it won't be the united Ireland that we were told about years ago when we were growing up. It will eventually lead to a different new Ireland, which will be based on respect for the Unionist community and the Nationalist community and all the other communities that have come to join us since. So thank you very much.
Lastly, folks, I'd like to introduce Neil Carmichael. Neil is a trustee of the Edward Heath Foundation, and he's going to close our seminar today. Thanks, Neil.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming today. The idea for having this was actually born in Brussels when Mary McVie and I were representing our respective houses at the European Union Historical and Political Houses Association. And it's a really important opportunity, I think, to underline some of the points that actually Geoff Martin was making earlier before about the importance of Europe and how that has actually impacted the things that we do. But Mary and I came up with the idea. But it has to be said that when you come up with a good idea, you need somebody to actually implement it. So I'm going to give full salute to Tim. Wave your arm, Tim. Because he actually did it, and it's to him that we have to thank for all of the excellent speakers, except two which I managed to wheel in. But they were good speakers as well, because one of them's still here. Two of them are still here, so thank you. So it's been a great occasion. Why are we doing this? Why is the Edward Heath Charitable Foundation doing this? Well, one of the things is this. If you look back to 50 years, you can see key things that happened in the 1970s which have relevance to us today. The energy crisis, leaving the European Union, or rather joining it then and leaving it now. And actually Sunningdale speaks up too as a classic example of public policy being delivered sensibly, and you've all come up with the reasons why Sunningdale made a difference, or at least pointed the way. One obvious point is that it essentially established the principles for further improvement in Northern Ireland, because they are the same principles that you see in Good Friday. They are the same principles that you'd speak to now about bringing about a lasting proper peace and settlement in Northern Ireland. So those principles then were put right. But there's a couple other things which I've noticed are really important and have come up today. One is actually the question of institutional memory. We heard from the Northern Ireland office about the continuity issue between Heath and Wilson. But of course, it's also important to know what you did and learn from what you did and remember what you did. And I think institutional memory in public policy, public life, in politics, and I am actually a former Conservative Member of Parliament, I'll mention that in a minute, all have an impact on the way in which things are actually delivered. So that memory is important. The second key thing which came up for me, and it was a question wasn't actually answered completely, is actually when do you have a general election? Now, you might well ask Rishi Sunak, and he'll tell you not on a rainy day. But the February 28th election was actually really important, in my view, for this country, because it set in train a number of things which I don't think were right and helpful. One of them was a disquiet about the European Union, which never really left us, even though we had our first referendum in 1975. But we've effectively never really properly dug into Europe and become properly European. But something else about that election was actually the impact it had on Sunningdale. Because you can see that had Heath continued to be Prime Minister with a majority, things might have been different. because it is completely true that Harold Wilson was not focused on the issue at the time when he became Prime Minister in March 1974. Merlin Rees was actually an acolyte of Jim Callaghan's and shoved in because there was a ministerial post to be filled and Jim Callaghan wanted Merlin Rees to have something. And don't forget, Merlin Rees' successor was actually Roy Mason, who sat for 3 years not doing anything except keeping the lid on things. So the Labour government then was not necessarily focused on what really mattered to the future of Northern Ireland. That, I think, is the second thing. So it's actually about getting the right leadership and continuing with it in an appropriate and helpful manner. So those are two key lessons, I think, have come out of this session. We'll be doing many more of these things, many more, because I think it's really important that we do not forget that there was a time when policy was made with evidence always being applied, with rigour and intellectual power always being used. And I don't think that's necessarily characterised everything that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years in British government. And I don't think it's necessarily always apparent everywhere else as well, but certainly not in recent years. I lost my seat in 2017, largely on the matter of the European Union, because I was such a strong supporter of us remaining in it. And I do think that that's one of the things that we will regret. And I leave you with this little vignette. I now run the Association of Dental Groups. And we've got an issue about a composite material, which I'm not going to go into because I don't want to worry about this. But there are 2 ways it will be handled. One is through the European Union by issuing a directive. And of course, that applies to what's happening in Northern Ireland. So you would think that someone in Whitehall would say, aha, Northern Ireland should do as they do, and we will do as we do. Actually, no. They're going to renegotiate the thing so that Britain, together with Northern Ireland, actually implements this directive in a sort of medium term. I think that's really interesting. And I think if you think of the consequences of that and several other decisions which will be similar, you will conclude, I think, that Europe still matters even if we're not in, and that it's going to matter more because we're not in within the context that we have just been discussing. So with that thought, I want to thank you all very much indeed for coming along today. It's been an absolutely fabulous occasion. I want to thank, obviously, the Hume Foundation and the Department of Foreign Affairs and my colleagues who are busily preparing for the Salisbury lecture, which is taking place on Thursday, where we'll be, because it's an election year, indeed an election month, we're talking about the importance of the Queen rather than some senior politician coming along. But in future, we will revisit these and other issues through what I've just launched, the Edward Heath Academic Forum. Thank you all very much indeed.